So just by way of introduction, I am a psychiatrist, and I began work in the area of mental health really soon after my training in the Maudsley Hospital in London. I found myself in Zimbabwe, where I was one of 9 psychiatrists serving a country of 10 million people. In fact, I often remember back in those days when I realized that there were actually more psychiatrists in my corridor in the hospital that I had trained in England than there were in the entire country that I found myself in. Nonetheless, at the time when I landed there were a number of myths that were prevailing about mental health problems, particularly in the global health context. And here, of course, I want to make a huge distinction between what conversations we listen to often when we talk about rethinking mental health, which comes from a very psychiatry perspective. Here I found myself in a context where psychiatry practically didn't exist. And so it was really almost inevitable that I had to engage with a much larger and much more dominant non-psychiatric healthcare system. And there were many myths that prevailed there. First of all, that mental health problems were a Western problem. They didn't occur amongst Black, brown, and poor people. That actually mental health was a luxury item for poor people and poor countries. There were far more important things for poor people to worry about, for example, their physical health. Or that actually mental health problems were simply a medicalization of a political issue. There was an extension of social suffering. That these were not really serious health conditions because you couldn't actually measure them in a tangible way as you could, for example, HIV/AIDS, which was at that time in the mid-1990s when I found myself in Zimbabwe, the leading cause of death in Southern Africa. And moreover, the impression was that mental health care could only be provided by very expensive healthcare professionals, and the treatments were of dubious effectiveness and also in fact, were very expensive and it required a very long duration. This was a very common set of beliefs back in the 1990s. And it is this set of beliefs that therefore prohibited health systems in the global south, those who finance health systems, from actually doing anything about mental health. Over the last 25 years, I have devoted my entire career to living and working in Southern Africa initially, and then in India for much of my career. I have sought to question and interrogate some of these myths through empirical science that combines both the best methods that come from the humanities and the social sciences, including ethnography, all the way through to the science that underpins the foundations of medicine, such as, for example, randomized controlled trials. I've been very privileged to work with a very wide range of institutions and partnerships, almost all in the global south, and to work with a very diverse range of disciplines, also grounded in the global south. And so if I had to leave with a few key messages that I've taken away from these 25 years of enriching experiences that address the myths that I showed earlier, these are the messages. First of all, it is not true that mental illnesses are a Western construction. Every single community that I worked in has shown that mental health problems are in fact universal. And indeed, perhaps surprisingly to my own beliefs back in the mid-90s, fresh from a course in medical anthropology, these actually look pretty similar in different parts of the world. And indeed, they also respond similarly to the kinds of interventions that have been developed by medical psychiatry and psychology. That being said, mental health is not simply something one can categorize into binary diagnostic boxes, assuming that everyone in that box has exactly the same needs. In fact, mental health is hugely individualized and is inseparable from one's personal life story and social and economic circumstances. In order for us to deliver mental health care, we must step outside the clinic, we must step outside the biomedical model and embrace a diversity of perspectives, experiences, and providers. And I'll speak more about that a little later. And that people with a lived experience must be central to all aspects of mental health care, from designing mental health care systems to being engaged in its delivery and extremely importantly, holding the mental health care system accountable. Really, if there was a set of key messages that really, I think, summarized my own journey from where I was as a freshly trained psychiatrist arriving in Zimbabwe to where I am now teaching global health and global mental health in particular, these messages really capture them succinctly. Indeed, global mental health, which is a discipline not of psychiatry, but a discipline of global health, and it's really important for me to stress that, is an area of study, research, and practice that places a priority not only of improving mental health. Please remember, this is not about treating mental illness alone, but also, and I've highlighted this extremely important point, achieving equity in mental health for all people everywhere. Global mental health is not the practice of psychiatry in developing countries. Global mental health is about the restructuring of mental health care systems everywhere, including in wealthy countries, which have equally difficult issues and challenges regarding disparities in mental health outcomes in their own populations. In other words, much of what I'm about to describe to you that has come from the global south has huge implications on how healthcare systems reimagine themselves in the north as well. I want to really start the scientific story from an initiative that Dom Insel, then the director of the National Institutes for Mental Health, launched about 15 years ago. This was an initiative to really identify the leading research priorities that the NIMH and other global research funders needed to invest in if they were to shift the needle on the burden of mental health problems. It was clear already by then that the narrow biomedical Western model of psychiatry and psychology had singularly failed to shift that needle, unlike pretty much every other branch of medicine. And there was a real need for us to map out the research questions that went beyond a narrow focus on biomedical psychiatry to understand how we might, in fact, change the narrative. We brought together 400 practitioners, activists, people with a lived experience, and scientists from across different disciplines from a very diverse set of global contexts, and pretty much did a Delphi-style research priority setting exercise, asking them what are the key priorities that need to be addressed. All those priorities turned out to be questions around human rights, social determinants, and implementation science. And over the last 10 to 15 years, the NIMH and a variety of other funders have pumped more than $1 billion of new money to address these research questions, the lion's share of which has actually gone to the global south, creating an incredible flourishing of research capacity, particularly in these areas in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And today, I can tell you with great confidence that thanks to this enormous investment of science, we know how to deliver clinical and preventive interventions in an affordable and acceptable way in any resource setting, such as in this particular image from Zimbabwe, where the woman on the right, who is a grandmother in Harare, has been trained to deliver a brief psychological intervention to the woman on the left, who has been detected as having significant symptoms of mood problems in the context of her recent pregnancy. She's been referred by a nurse in the clinic that you can see at the rear of this picture, because there's no place in the clinic to deliver an interpersonal behavioral intervention. And so the intervention's delivered on this wooden bench, which the founder of this program, Dixon Chibanda, has very evocatively called the friendship bench. Important to say, the friendship bench has now been exported to the West, and in fact, there are friendship benches now in New York City, just demonstrating how the global South, thanks to global mental health, can teach the global North on how to reimagine mental health care. I myself have been working with a community-based not-for-profit organization in India for 25 years. And what you can see here is a series of different headings of articles published in journals like The Lancet and JAMA and so on, which demonstrate the breadth of different kinds of innovations that Sangat has evolved to both promote mental health, prevent mental health problems, and support the recovery from mental health problems across the life course, and then applied these innovations to randomized controlled trials in real-world settings. I want to illustrate one such trial, which was for people with long-standing psychotic conditions, on average a duration of 10 to 12 years, which in most parts of the world, if you do receive care, comprises only psychopharmacology. And we wanted to really examine whether a much more community-focused, strengths-based focused, family-focused intervention delivered by lay people or community-based workers could actually improve upon what was until then a purely pharmacological model of care. We ran a large randomized controlled trial in 3 sites in India. The findings were published in The Lancet. And this video, which I hopefully will come through clearly, really demonstrates what the key ingredients of this approach were.
एकदमच मला कम से कम 5 मिनिटं आवाज माझ्या कानाला देव बोलतोय असं.
मानसिक आजार हे काय असतं हे मला याच्याबद्दल काहीच माहिती नव्हतं. म्हणजे हा प्रकारच माहिती नाही. मला काहीतरी म्हणजे समायोजित वर्तनात काहीतरी आहे असं मला सारखं वाटायचं. पण कोणापुढे बोलायचं हा एक माझ्या मनामध्ये कुचंबणा व्हायचं. आजूबाजूचे लोक ते दृष्टिकोनातून बघायचे, हसती बघा कशी. कोण माणूस पुन्हा येणारा असला तरी त्याला असं वाटायचं की माझ्याकडेच बघत हसली, म्हणजे तो माणूस असा बघत उभा राहायचा. मग मी ती उभी राहायचे. मी 2-3 माणसांना पण आवडलं त्याच्यात. वाईट वाटायला लागलं की रडायला रडायचं, कुणाला सांगायचं नाही असंही म्हणून.
कॉप्सी हा प्रकल्प जो आहे तो त्याचा लॉंग फॉर्म असा आहे, केअर ऑफ पीपल्स सिझोफ्रेनिया इन इंडिया. म्हणजे औषध उपचाराव्यतिरिक्त जर काही सामाजिक उपचार पद्धती जर या लोकांना चालू केली.
डॉक्टर आणि पेशंटच्या मधला दुवा असा आमचा रोल होता.
म्हणलं पाठवा की सर, बरोबर आहे. कारण आम्हाला माहिती येते कसं काय गोळ्या द्यायच्या, कसं काय करायचं किंवा काय करायचे, कसं त्याच्याशी वागायचं, कसं काय हे म्हणजे आम्हाला माहिती पडेल.
हे तुम्ही जे प्रोग्राम हे ठेवलं होतं ना, हा, तर त्याचा पुरेपूर फायदा आम्हाला झालाय. म्हणजे औषधांचं तर झालंयच, पण औषधांपेक्षा पण ते जास्त म्हणजे संभाषणाने यांच्याशी व्हायचं ना, बोलायच्या.
जोपर्यंत जमेल ना तोपर्यंत तरी काम असावं आपल्याला असं वाटतं. जोपर्यंत जमेल तोपर्यंत. दिवसभर म्हणजे काही विचार वगैरे काही येत नाही. दिवसभर याच्यातच मन रमतं ना.
आता जरा बरं, आधीपेक्षा बरं. हे कामाला पण जाते त्यामुळं शाळेत आधी शाळेचा खर्च आधी नव्हता, पण आता खर्च आलाय ते मम्मी भावा.
Work is not just for money. It is for self-esteem. It's what you think about yourself. It's the way you spend your time. It's your productivity. It's what you give to society, what you get from society. So when they start working, then they feel much better. People learn to respect them. They start liking themselves.
आत्ताची परिस्थिती आणि त्या टायमाच्या परिस्थितीमध्ये किती आसमानचा फरक. म्हणजे माझं कारण म्हणतंय इथून पुढे जे तुम्ही चितलेलं काम आहे, म्हणजे जे माइंड मध्ये तुम्ही ठरवलेलं आहे, पुढे लय त्याचं चालना मिळणार.
This large body of science, which I think is perhaps the most exciting body of new science that has emerged from the field of mental health in the last decade, has been synthesized in a variety of different papers. For example, these 2 that have been led by younger colleagues in my team. On the one hand, interventions for people with serious enduring mental illness, and on the other hand, interventions for people with mood, anxiety, and trauma-related conditions. As of last count, there are more than 100 such randomized controlled trials from more than 40 low and middle income countries around the world across the full range of mental health conditions and tasks, from prevention all the way through to recovery. What this body of science is demonstrating is how we can redefine mental health care. by moving away from narrow biomedical models that privilege diagnoses and drugs to much broader person-centered models that also target psychological mechanisms and the social mechanisms that lead to mental health problems and to their perpetuation. These are typically brief interventions that are delivered where people are, typically in their own homes, in primary care settings, and increasingly on telemedicine platforms. They can be delivered by anyone in the community who has a calling or authority to care for others, such as community health workers, flipping the whole narrative that we often hear that communities are under-resourced because they don't have enough mental health professionals, to actually recognizing that every community has the resources that are needed for mental health care, people who care for one another. And what we need to be doing is to support these individuals to learn, to master, and to deliver these evidence-based psychosocial interventions so that people in their communities can benefit from them. In simple form, this means building and redesigning the entire workforce that is devoted to mental health care from what has historically been a top-down approach with most resources going to specialty services to a bottom-up approach which has a grassroots focus with resources being more evenly balanced so that they are now being utilized to build the workforce at the base of the pyramid, now backed by very solid science. This, of course, has been the great motivation for me when more than 20 years ago I wrote the first edition of this book, Where There Is No Psychiatrist, which became very widely used. But at that time, it's fair to say that a lot of what I was writing was not backed by empirical science. The big body of science that I've just referred to allowed me to rewrite this book completely in a second edition with my colleague Charlotte Hanlon, who has spent most of her own working career in Ethiopia. This evidence is transforming mental health action globally at the level of both global public health institutions like the World Health Organization and the World Bank, but also at the level of virtually every developing country, national mental health policies, such as the National Mental Health Policy of India that I serve on the drafting committee for. But importantly, this evidence is also transforming the way that rich countries in the North are also reimagining their mental health care system. This report from the RAND Corporation, published last year on how to transform the US mental health system, has actually called for embracing global mental health innovations in a complete restructuring of the US mental health system. A few years ago, and Helen was, of course, very central to this particular commission, I led, along with several others, a group of 28 individuals from across the world to examine this exciting body of evidence and to define what the implications of this evidence were for a roadmap towards a reimagination of mental health care everywhere. I won't go into details of this particular issue's recommendations simply, but I wanted to emphasize as I close what was one of the three major principles that we called for in a completely reimagined mental health care system, and that was the rights-based approach. We identified three fundamental rights. First, the right for populations to be protected from known harms to their mental health, for only then could we actually really reduce the burden of mental health problems. But equally, we also call for the right for people who are already living with a mental health problem to be protected from harms that can worsen their mental health. The second was a right to dignity and freedom, completely embracing the CRPD's call for ultimately the elimination of all forms of coercion and violence in mental health care, and the empowerment of all individuals with mental health problems to make decisions in their own best interest that were aligned with their wills and preferences. And thirdly, the right to receive care, such as the number of different psychosocial interventions that global mental health practitioners had shown could be delivered where people are, by people in their own communities, without the need of a formal diagnosis. I want to end with just telling you a little bit about where my own journey is taking me as I go forward. Having spent much of the last 25 years in the Global South, really building the evidence base around the burden of suffering, as well as the solutions for mental health concerns in those kinds of contexts, I have now switched my attention towards figuring out how we can rapidly scale up these evidence-based psychosocial interventions through community-based resources. And to that end, I launched 3 years ago the Empower program to harness the incredible opportunities that digital technologies offer us to build a community-based workforce by using a suite of digital tools that can enable frontline workers to learn, master, and deliver quality-assured, evidence-based psychosocial interventions. This is not just a training platform. It's far more than that. We accompany, and here I use the term that my late and dear colleague Paul Farmer used to use to describe community health workers. He often described community health workers as people who accompanied an individual on their journey to recovery, whether it was with HIV, TB, or serious enduring mental illness. You broke bread with your patients and you accompanied them by living in their communities, visiting them at home, and being constantly by their side when they needed you. In the same analogy, we have built a platform that accompanies frontline workers, not only to learn new interventions, not only to become competent in them, but to then ultimately master those interventions, to become credentialed, and then to be on a lifelong journey of continuing quality assurance and support, so that ultimately these frontline workers can become the coaches for the next generation of learners. To give you one example of how this might look in the real life, we began our journey just 2 or 3 years ago, starting off with a 6-session treatment for depression that we had developed in India and has now been shown not only to work in other developing countries, but incredibly has also been embraced in the US and Canada in one of the largest psychotherapy trials that is being conducted in North America for women with perinatal depression. We have begun the task of scaling this up by digitizing the entire curriculum to learn this 6-session treatment in the Hindi and Gujarati languages of North and Western India, and now started scaling up this brief intervention through the ASHA, India's community health workers, more than 1 million of whom make this the largest health workforce in the world working in the community, and develop digital tools to support not only their learning, but their supervision and quality assurance. Most excitingly, we brought this work to the US as well. Thanks to being awarded the Lone Star Prize last year, our colleagues and us are now beginning to adapt and roll out this 6-session treatment through community health workers, particularly serving underserved communities, the Latino and African American communities, and low-income communities who live predominantly in the border counties between Texas and Mexico. The Lone Star Depression Challenge will also ultimately be working with faith-based communities, so to build the capabilities of this very important platform to reach out and provide mental health care to people in those communities. Empower is currently using a staging approach to design a suite of different interventions at the wellness end to promote and prevent mental health problems, to empower every individual in every community to learn what you can do in a single encounter to build social connectedness as a very important tool to promote mental health. These are all just, the provider names you see here are just kind of holding names, but these are also names that are being widely used by non-for-profit grassroots organizations who are engaged in this work. Further down the staging dimension, we are targeting people who are developing symptoms of distress well before they reach clinical threshold severity, with the goal of early intervention and indicated prevention, a suite of interventions that target both adults and children and young people through brief evidence-based psychosocial interventions, targeting particularly community health workers as the delivery agent. And then at the other end, as it were, of the dimension, for people who have got enduring disabilities associated with their mental illness, with a goal of inclusion and prevention of relapse, to use peer support as a way to address social determinants and build coping skills. Through this suite of interventions, we believe we can address almost the full range of mental health needs in the population, with the singular exception, of course, of the acute clinical needs that do clearly need a more biomedical approach within a clinical context. This is the only way we will deal with the rising need for mental health care in the population. This rising need was already evident well before the pandemic, and health systems around the world were failing to meet that need, in large part because the focus on the care system was at the tip of the pyramid. I hope I've convinced you that the large body of implementation science from the global south is changing that narrative. And to actually meet that increasing need, we're going to need to completely transform our understandings of what the mental health workforce looks like and how we will rapidly build the capabilities of that workforce to deliver interventions. And this is my last slide. In order to do that, we need to reframe mental health as a global public good, something which is a universal human quality and not just a biomedical entity, which is indivisible from other aspects of our health, particularly our physical and our spiritual health. It's important to all people, especially young people, and I think we can all agree that this is a historic moment for us to reimagine and rethink mental health care, because never before has mental health been so central in the global and national discourse as in the last 2 years.
Thank you so much, Vikram.